I used to work in a factory owned by the cartel, and I got the F out of there. I used to work in a factory in Jalisco, Mexico, that was a money laundering operation for one of the cartels. I kept my head down. Then the money laundering expanded to torture. They'd bring in a new employee, always dressed in the same clothes, assign him to the boiler room, and that afternoon there'd be loud music, banging, and screams. Then we'd never see him again. Workplace accident. I knew a guy who did cleanup for that. He'd tell us stories about flayings and severed limbs, voltages and famished rats, how they'd sometimes make the guys eat parts of themselves, or make carvings from broken bones sticking out of their bodies, or else waterboard them in tubs of their own bodily fluids. Jesus, he'd make us throw up sometimes. The next day I'd go to work and have trouble concentrating, imagining what else fucking went on there. One morning about a dozen barrels showed up at the loading dock. We thought they were chemicals, so we unloaded them, rolled them in. A friend of mine popped one of the lids and there were liquefied people inside. Traitors, witnesses, who the hell knows? And the smell, the goddamn smell. I'll never forget it. Like it's burned into my nostrils. Next time they brought in a new employee, they sat him down in the cafeteria and slid a big old thermos in front of him. Made him pour it himself, then drink the homemade soup. All of it. All 1.5 quarts. I'd never seen a man gag so much. And when he just couldn't do it anymore, they beat him in the head with a thermos. He was dented and purple by the time he finished, with human dripping down his face. I can't walk past a rain barrel on a suburban fucking American street without getting the shakes. But that's why I did it, to make enough to pay a coyote to get me the hell out of Mexico. You can't imagine the anxiety of working there. The fear. Every day, every sound. Regular employees disappeared sometimes too. Maybe they'd seen too much. Maybe they tried to steal. It was tempting. God, was it tempting? You'd peek into a room and see a mountain of cash on the table. No one around. Just sitting there. But you'd have to be a fucking idiot to take it, because they always knew. So I walked on by. I'm telling you all this because I want you to know how frayed my nerves were. The constant stress stretched me like a guitar string, but it also made me sharp. I was attuned to every detail of that godforsaken place. Head down but eyes looking everywhere. I was a good employee. I was an excellent observer. I'm not making any of this shit up. I was working after hours one night when the lights in the factory suddenly went out. No warning. Panic, but not nearly enough. Men with guns made slow rounds back and forth across the factory floor, but no one said a word. I knew the factory had backup generators, yet no one turned them on. We all just existed there, in the deep, dark heat of a Mexican summer's dusk. I knew something was up. The gunman's boots beat a plodding rhythm into the stagnant air. I was reclining against one of the machines when I saw him in the distance, dressed in a Zicali, his face painted in glowing yellow and green, and with colored feathers woven into his hair. He was an anachronism. An Aztec priest hurried along by guards toward a pair of stairs leading below the factory floor. One of the bosses was alongside too, which meant that whoever this Aztec was, he was important. The bosses didn't usually visit this place. For reasons I don't understand even now, I moved casually from the machine and followed them through the gloom. Already I could hear the Aztec speak words I didn't recognize, intoning and repeating them as he walked, and I imagined his eyes rolling backwards into his head, then appearing through holes on the back of his skull, slithering through his long black hair, and staring at me. Right at me. The Aztec was smoking a pipe and the vapors must have gotten to me. They all went down the stairs. I waited, covered in sweat. A few minutes later, after making sure I wouldn't be seen, I followed. It was darker down here. The emergency lights were off, and the only brightness flowed from the end of a long hall that had been partially excavated out of rock. Making my way through the hall, I noticed that the rough walls were covered in smears of blood, handprints, stickiness. I considered turning back, but I heard a scraping somewhere in the dying light behind me, and the fear of being found drove me forward even as the intensity of the oncoming light increased, and I approached the end of the hall, which culminated in a vast underground chamber in the middle of which the Aztec, the boss and several guards stood at the rim of a large crater-like opening in the earth. The Aztec had raised his arms. He was chanting. Every few syllables he reached into a pouch, pulled out what looked like a bone and tossed it into the opening. On the opposite side of the opening was the dark terminus of a tunnel from which emerged, one after another, 5 cement trucks. Their engines rumbling. Their drums turning. One by one, they backed towards the opening, extended their discharge chutes and expelled the pink, decaying contents of their mechanical bowels. Slowly, the human sludge flowed. Once all 5 trucks had been emptied, they disappeared into the tunnel. The gunk reached almost to the rim of the opening, bubbling like a gently simmering soup, and as the bubbles burst they made sounds like those said by the Aztec, who was the only one not shielding his face from the unbearable stench. The boss and guards looked on the cusp of puking until one of them did, into the bubbling mess, which subsumed the puke with a low, disgusting moan. Things arose now out of the mess, trees of muscle and tendon, erupting and dissolving, columns of bone, imploding into white dust, pulsating masses of indescribable vileness, whose reverberations continued long after they themselves returned to liquid. Arose and returned. Became and. The guards lifted their weapons, shaking, wiping sweat from their faces. Tranquilo, the boss hissed. It was then the Aztec spoke the only word I understood, roared it at the bubbling liquid, whose surface deformed into ripples that lapped at the rim at the guards and the boss, who instinctively backed away, as the word filled the chamber. Mictlantecuhtli. Out of the death mire, out of the miasma of decaying humanity, from a time ancient and before, he came, Aztec god of the underworld, tremendous figure of bone wrapped in cascading flesh, with a glowing, skeletal head whose permanently open jaws threatened to consume us all. One of the guards stood screaming. Another turned, ran, and Mictlantecuhtli reached out and grabbed him, squeezed until the guard popped and pushed the resulting organic goop into himself, not through his mouth but through his body, and by the same amount he grew. Katamari fucking Damasi. The screaming guard started shooting, but the bullets merely sunk into Mictlantecuhtli with a repulsive flop. The Aztec had stripped naked and was holding out his arms, as if waiting to be taken and added to the god of the underworld, which Mictlantecuhtli obligingly did. The Aztec disappeared, chanting. Flop. The boss had taken off with the remaining guards, heading for the tunnel down which the cement trucks had gone. As for me, I hugged the side of the cavernous fucking hall, not caring about the blood falling down the sides. Not caring that the hall itself was becoming softer and warmer. Not noticing that everything was beginning to pulse light from no source, to flicker, on and off, on and off. Mictlantecuhtli erupted out of the opening, landing with a sickening splash just behind the fleeing boss and guards. For a moment he stood in his full glory, divine in his construction of smooth, yellow bone over which were draped resplendent cloths of dead anatomy. Except the cloths were ever in motion, flowing, and so the god of the underworld loomed as an osseous fountain disgorging now and forever the dread essence of humanity. For the first time I understood the true meaning of awe. I was so horrified, I craved to worship. I could imagine why the cartel wished to bring such a monstrous deity back from wherever the hell the Spanish had trapped him. What a weapon he could be. To have him on your side was to be victorious. The cartel could have marched against the US fucking army and won. But how could the fools believe they would keep control? How could they ever believe that? With the speed of a jaguar, McLanticutly lunged forward on hands and knees after the boss and guards who'd run desperately into the blackness of the tunnel seeking safety they knew they'd never find, and passing through the gaping darkness, he took it with him. Then gunshots. Then screams. Then nothing except me fleeing up the same hall that I had come, fleeing without looking back, barely aware the hall was no longer a hall excavated out of rock, but an organic tube, an intestine, throbbing, secreting, constricting, so that when I reached the stairs, I scrambled up and out through an orifice, before falling wet and bloody onto the factory floor. The lights were still out. It was quiet. Empty. Because you'd have to be a fucking idiot to take it, right? Still wheezing, I rounded the corner to where the counting rooms were. One of the doors was unlocked. Cash on a table. Guy on a chair. Before he could raise an arm I smashed his face, then beat him unconscious before dumping the money into a duffel bag and getting the fuck out of there. Dead of night. Factory to parked car. Avoiding streetlights. Engine, on. Deep breath. Deep breath. Phone call to a cousin who knows a guy. I have the cash. Tonight. Years later, here I am. In America, land of the fucking free. Big house in the suburbs. Big tits on my big dumb American wife. Big cars. Big Mac. Big lifestyle. I have to live big, because I know what's fucking coming. It's not the cartel. It's not climate change or economic collapse. It's the underworld literally about to get real. It's Earth getting gutted and us drowning in its spilled guts. It's not even McLanticutly that terrifies me. Although that motherfucker fucking terrifies me a lot. It's the bosses. The idiots who bring demons into this world thinking they can keep them on a leash. Live life, amigos. Because soon it's coming to a dead fucking end.